Hello and welcome to Hamilton, the podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
And we're in the hurricane.
Vinton, I feel like you're being really quiet.
Yeah, there's calm, there's quiet, just for a moment. Or an episode.
Just this one episode. Are we gonna put on our sleepy time voices?
We gotta put on our sleepy time
I hope
voices.
you're breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth, and you're in a peaceful place right now. Go to your happy place.
I'm feeling zen.
You feel it zen?
Yeah, let's do this.
Okay, let's do this episode. This is about Hurricane,
Yes.
when Alexander Hamilton comes on stage and he's going to rehash a lot of the events from our opening song where you learn about Alexander Hamilton's childhood. He's going to kind of springboard us into the rest of his life, running through his entire life story with some key moments from his own unique perspective.
Right, he's going to be looking back on what's brought him to this point. So in this song, everything calms down, kind of like we did at the beginning of this podcast. You go from a few songs there where the tension's high to this moment of calm, this moment of peace. The music calms down, the stage lights actually get darker, and we get Hamilton himself reflecting. This isn't Burr telling a story. This isn't someone else coming in and telling us Hamilton's story. This is going to be Hamilton's side of things here. We're going to hear what he thinks.
Yeah, and you get to hear the characteristic Hamiltonian arrogance in his telling. This is a lot of reconstructionism as he looks back on his own history. And there's so much selfishness and victim mentality in Hamilton's perspective where he's talking about all these terrible things happened to me, but I solved the problems. Yeah. I fixed everything. I was not the recipient of help. I was the active agent of change in my life for the better. Before this podcast started, right before we started recording, I did some quick math. And so give me a little bit of grace if you're on Twitter later and you're doing the calculations yourself, because this was like literally 5 minutes ago when I counted up all of the I's, the me's, and the my's in this particular song. And in a song where Hamilton sings less than 300 words, almost 50 of them, I counted 41 I, me, or my's in this song out of 247 words that Hamilton sings, which is about 17% of this song is dedicated to him saying the word I, me, or my. That's almost 1 in 5. That's 1 in 6 words that he dedicates to just, I did this. This is my story. Me. I did these things. This is what I am going to do. He even builds himself up to the level of God at one point.
Yes.
It's terrifying,
we know
the level of arrogance.
This is a tragedy. This story is a tragedy. And when you have a tragedy and your protagonist puts himself in the place of God,
oh man,
you know things are about to go downhill.
Absolutely. So when he says that line, and when my prayers to God were met with indifference, I picked up my pen. I wrote my own deliverance. I almost imagine all the cast members on the stage backing up like, watch
out for lightning. You're in the middle of a storm saying this? This is a bad idea.
Exactly. A storm is the entire driving metaphor. God is about to smite you for sure. Right. So he's absolutely fixating on his own situation and on his own prideful belief that he has risen over every single complication that has ever come into his life. He takes credit for him getting off the island. He takes credit for making Eliza fall for him. He takes credit for essentially being more powerful than the Liberty Bell that was ringing across America. He is the most powerful agent in his entire life story, in his own words.
Yeah, you really do pick up on this idea here. He talks about the storm that happened, and I mean, all these things that happened to him. And then he lumps in his affair with Mariah Reynolds as something that happened to him, as if he had no part in it. It was something that came out of nowhere and happened to him like a natural disaster. He's not taking credit for it, and he's not accepting blame, and he's not ready to accept the consequences for it.
Right, but he is taking credit for one thing, and that's him being the person who can get himself out of the trouble. Yeah. He's like, I have the power to actually fix the problem. I didn't make the problem. These things happened to me. They were all like a storm I couldn't control, but guess what? I am powerful. I am the one who has the agency to write myself out of trouble, write myself out of hell, and get myself to the place of success.
So you do see this hubris coming in, really.
For sure. He is guilty of avarice. If anything is his character's tragic, fatal flaw, it is his pride, his ambition. Ambition is his folly. He is an Icarus who has flown too high. In the first half of the musical, you see Hamilton's rise up to sitting at the right hand of the Father, being placed as George Washington's Treasury Secretary, and you see that he has risen up to a place of prominence from a place of poverty. And then in the second act, you see that entire cycle reversed, where he starts out prominent and he starts destroying his own position, and he falls down to the place in the very end of this musical where he ends up with almost nothing at the end. And so we get to see his rise and his fall, and here throughout it all, he has that avarice, that pride, and it's all absolutely essential to Hamilton's character and his own way of seeing himself.
Yeah. And writing yourself out of bad circumstances is not bad. We're not trying to say that. We're not trying to say that part of it was bad. As we've said before in this podcast, and you know if you've listened to us, it's awesome that he was able to do that. It's great that he was able to write himself out of those circumstances. I mean, that's why Lin-Manuel Miranda wanted to do this musical. I mean, he said, quote, "I decided I had to write this play. Hamilton literally wrote a verse to get him off an island. That's the most hip-hop stuff ever. He transcends the struggle. And if you look at your favorite rapper, that's most likely what they did." Mm-hmm. And that's true. They write themselves out. A big theme in hip-hop are these kids who come out of nothing. They come out of poverty. They come out of broken families. They write about it, and they find fortune and fame. They find the life that they wanted by writing about the life that was so disastrous.
Yeah, it's almost a bit of a defense mechanism for someone coming from Alexander Hamilton's background, where he comes from such oppression, and he does get to be the victim of a lot of really tough situations. Some of it is him being the victim of his own decisions and his own bad choices, but a lot of it is actually things that happen to him. Because, look, life is hard, guys. Life is tough, right? And some people do have it tougher than others. If you're orphaned as a child in the Caribbean islands and you're abandoned and you're poor and your mother dies while she's holding you and you are trying to rise above that, you have a lot of obstacles to overcome. And there is something beautiful in optimism, that you can believe in a better future, that you can believe in a future where you aren't trapped by your circumstances, but you can rise above that. I think that type of an ambition is really, really beautiful. So in this, there is a beautiful side of ambition that we want to applaud, because that's something we get out of Hamilton's life as a huge takeaway, that we want to be able to be people who can always push forward to something else, never letting our circumstances drag us down, never saying that, you know what, I made this mistake, oh my goodness, I'm going to live in shame, I'm going to live in guilt, I'm going to be terribly oppressed for the rest of my life. And Hamilton doesn't do that. He gets into this tough spot, he backs himself into a corner, and he says, okay, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to do something to get out of this tough spot. The problem is he doesn't always do the right thing. Yeah. But there is something in this, so that while we're attacking his own avarice and his own inner ambition that ends up being his folly and his downfall in the end, we also want to applaud his optimistic ambition to take charge and actually believe in a future where he's not just a victim.
Oh, absolutely.
So there's a lot of back and forth. We could spend all day talking about whether his ambition is good, his ambition is bad, whether it's completely neutral and it's just a tool that he can use wisely or poorly. But I think it's about time for us to actually dive into the lyrics of this song.
Yeah, before we jump into the lyrics here, though, let's just set the stage real quick.
Oh, yeah, that'd be good.
So in the staging, we just came off of We Know. Hamilton's stressed out. He's on the defensive with these three people. Mm-hmm. And Burr doesn't really confirm that he's going to not say anything about this. He refuses to give an answer there.
Yeah, there's that ambiguity, it seems, where nothing certain has actually happened yet. He hasn't actually been attacked in the press for his affair. Right. Burr hasn't taken these papers and published them for anyone to see. He hasn't even actively said, I'm going to do that thing. But there's a calmness where Hamilton has this awkwardness on stage almost, and he can't take that awkward silence of what might happen. My fate is in the hands of someone else now. My fate is in these three men, and I have to just trust them to hold on to this information. Hamilton is not the kind of guy who trusts his legacy to someone else.
Absolutely. We talk a lot about the history behind the lyrics here, but you also have to look at this musical as its own story.
Right.
And in the story that's being presented to us, he's coming off of this moment not knowing what's going to happen. He has to do something. In history, it wasn't him who leaked this to the public. He had to come in and do some cleanup work, definitely with the pamphlet that he did release, but he wasn't the one who actually sent the information out. Here in the story of our musical, it's not going to be some journalist who publishes saying that he had this affair. Hamilton himself is going to put the pamphlet out first, not as a response to, but just to let everyone know that this thing happened so that it can't be used against him by anybody else.
Right, so it's a preemptive strike in our musical rather than a reactive response to what was happening.
Exactly.
And I think that the eye of a hurricane is a perfect metaphor for him to use in this moment, where there's been a lot of stress that brought him up to this point. The front of the storm has hit. Jefferson, Madison, and Burr now have this information. They've confronted him. All of this stress with Congress and passing his plans have been really stressful on Hamilton. And a lot of things in the second half of this musical have been like the beginning of the storm. The storm front has been coming. It has hit, and everything is serious. But now in this moment, there's tension, and you don't know what's going to happen because the storms aren't hitting right now. And Hamilton says there's quiet for just a moment, and he's not going to leave that quiet as just a small little reprieve. He's going to use that quietness to get ahead of the next part of the storm so that he can say, I'm going to use this moment now so that the rest of the storm is, well, I'm sheltered from it, and I'm not going to be as aggressively hit by those things because I'm now prepared. So I appreciate the idea of that tension and that quiet and that uncertainty about what's going to happen next being the idea of that quiet moment in the middle of the storm. But how does Hamilton use that tension, that peacefulness of the moment where he doesn't have to do something? He could wait for something else to happen, but he's not that kind of guy. He's the ambitious guy who's going to actively go out and do something.
So in the staging, as he leaves that previous song, he walks to the center. And when he reaches the center of the stage, you see this light around him that kind of resembles a hurricane. Like, have you ever seen a picture of Earth from space, the way kind of that spiral cloud looking thing looks?
Oh, yeah.
Kind of resembles that from the pictures I've seen. And the stage will eventually start to turn around him. And you really do have this idea that he's standing in the middle of a storm. The stage is circling, the lights are circling around him, and the ensemble comes out and starts slowly moving around him as well with this circling motion. And they start kind of moving like they're being blown in the storm, and they start picking each other up. And then they eventually will grab his writing desk and his chair and pick those things up and move them like the storm is taking them.
There's a Wizard of Oz moment there where it's like you see all of the furniture flying around on the stage because the ensemble was actually carrying it around like that, like whirring around him. You almost imagine that you'll see some old lady in a bathtub floating across the window there because of the Wizard of Oz moments.
And I should mention the music has gotten very calm here comparatively to what it has been the past few songs.
Yeah, the music is calmer, the staging there is calmer, and then at the end of the song, when the Reynolds pamphlet is dropped, finally, you see some bright flashes, and the next song is super flashy, super bright, and big things happening on stage because this is the eye of the storm. This is the calm before the rest of the storm comes.
Yeah. So we already kind of mentioned it, but in the lyrics here, he's going to start off saying, in the eye of a hurricane, there is quiet. For just a moment, a yellow sky. And Robbie and I can relate to that. We're from Oklahoma. We've seen tornadoes. We've seen really bad storms. We know exactly what it looks like when a bad storm is about to hit. The sky does just completely change. You see it and you smell it and you hear it and you feel it in the air.
And as good Oklahomans, we don't go into our storm shelters immediately. We go out onto the front porch and look at the sky because it's gorgeous.
Which is how we know this so well.
It's gorgeous, but it's also devastating.
Yes.
Because we've both also driven past the areas of tragedy where the storms have hit, and we've had to volunteer and help out with areas like Moore, Oklahoma, and some really terrible things. But there is that dichotomy, I think, of the beauty in the tragedy. And so here you have the power behind Hamilton, which is his incredible brain, his incredible intelligence, and his writing. The pen of Hamilton is so powerful. It has written financial systems into existence. And here he has this incredible, powerful gift. It's also devastating if pointed towards the wrong people or towards, in this case, in a lot of ways, his family.
Yeah. I just love that imagery of that verse there because I don't know about you, but for me, because I know these of storms so well, the music here, the tone of the song, and the wording, I close my eyes, I see a storm. I see it happening. It fills my imagination immediately. It's so well done.
Yeah, there's definitely an immersive moment there where it's just really easy to get into that. And so from metaphor to actual history, he goes into the description of his life. And he goes to the very beginning when he says, when I was 17, a hurricane destroyed my town. I didn't drown. I couldn't seem to die.
Like we said, a little bit later here, he's going to say basically he's his own savior. He almost has this God complex right from the beginning. You can't kill me. I couldn't seem to die.
He's young, reckless, and he definitely feels like he couldn't die in all those moments. At the beginning of this musical, he was the kid who thought, I may die on the battlefield in glory, and that would be my way to go. But now that he's gone through all of those experiences and he's lived through them all, he has a little bit of a bigger head on his shoulders. He's that bobblehead Hamilton, where he is going to cause a lot of problems because of that characteristic cockiness that has come out of his arguably good ambition and his drive and his hunger that he had at the beginning. So he says, I couldn't seem to die. He's going to talk in a second about how he wrote a description of that storm and he went to the newspaper. Here he said, when I was 17, all of this took place. When he went to the newspaper publisher, he actually told the publisher that his age was, I'm a young lad of about 17. Which, as Ron Chernow points out early on in his biography, he says that that's an adolescent's way of saying, I am 16 and a half. Basically, like he wants to say, I'm about 17.
Yeah, I'm an adult.
I'm an adult.
So he starts off right here, the same thing that's going to be coming up over and over again throughout the song. I wrote my way out.
Mm-hmm.
Wrote everything down as far as I could see. I wrote my way out. I looked up, and the town had its eyes on me. And as we know, he wrote himself out of that situation. The town's going to come around him, like he mentions here. But this whole section, he's, like I mentioned, he's his own savior. He has an answer to everything. Kind of reminds me of Right Hand Man when Washington has those problems and he comes up and he's like, oh, what's the problem? I have this answer. What's the problem? I have this answer. What's the problem? I have this answer for it. He always has an answer. He can always write himself out of things.
Yeah, exactly. I love the phrase, the town had its eyes on me. Because in this whole musical, we've used the phrase, history has its eyes on you, over and over and over again. Yeah, and at the end of the song, the women in his life are going to come up and start singing that refrain over him. And it's almost a reminder that if you got your head out of the storm for a little bit, if you stopped just living in your moment and in your current situation, you could see that all of history is going to look back on this and remember the big ramifications of your decisions. Here, he has almost more of a short-sighted thing. He says, the town had its eyes on me. I'm only concerned with what's happening right here, right now, in this exact moment and place in time, because this is the place where I am, and so I'm going to not necessarily think of all of history looking back on me, which is a little bit of a turn because he cares so much about his legacy. But while we know that Hamilton is not at all short-sighted because he was a dreamer, he thought of so many of the things that became America eventually, he is a little short-sighted in this moment, saying he cares more about the town looking at him and the things that are about to happen and how he is going to write himself out of this situation. It's like he's in a hole and his solution is, I'm going to keep digging. But he basically starts that motif where he says, I had the hurricane come, I wrote about it, and that got me off the island where the hurricanes were. Something else comes up, I'm going to write about it, and that's going to get me out of that problem. And it's going to go on and on to where he says that his weapon is writing. He is an intelligent person, but his intelligence isn't there just for the sake of gathering knowledge. His intelligence is there to make sure he has an ambitious climb to prominence. And that's what he sees and that's what he values.
And that history has its eyes on you is going to come back, like I said, but also him saying, wrote everything down as far as I could see, comes back. And I think it's being used in two different ways in the song. Here, he's saying, basically, he grabbed every book off the shelf that he could. He learned as much as he could. He wrote down everything he could possibly see out there. At the end of this song, and I'll bring it up again when it comes by, but he says, I'm going to write everything down far as I can see. And here, it's different because he's narrow-minded now. He's focused so much on clearing his name on something that he's not seeing the big picture. He's not looking out to see. It's all from his point of view. It's all from his perspective now. He's not writing everything down that he can see, but everything from his perspective.
Yeah, I almost wonder if that homonym there, the play on the word I in that sentence is, I wonder if that's important at all, where he's saying, I wrote everything down as far as I could see personally, or I wrote everything down as far as the human eye could see. Right. And I just wrote everything down as far as the human eye could see. It's that idea of a double play, I think, that since it is an audible format, really, the way it's meant to be, there's a little bit of that. And he says, they passed the plate around. Total strangers were moved to kindness by my story. and they raised enough for me to book passage on a ship that was New York bound. So in a part of his story where the emphasis should be on how kind strangers are, people are kind, they give donations, they do something nice to him, he says, look, I moved them to kindness.
Exactly.
I was the active agent, they were reactive to me.
And that's what he's hoping to do in the Reynolds pamphlet. He's hoping to move a town to kindness so that they will come circle around him and raise him to glory. So he's going to go on to say, I wrote my way out of hell. He wrote himself out of those circumstances. He wrote his way to the revolution. He wrote himself through the revolution, really. He wrote for Washington. He wrote the Farmer Refuted that helped springboard a lot of people into that mentality of revolution.
Right, against Reverend Seabury.
Right. He says he was louder than the crack in the bell. And obviously he's referring to the Liberty Bell.
Right, yeah. The famous Liberty Bell, which hung in the Pennsylvania State House, the Independence Hall, basically. And it was there. The Liberty Bell actually predates the Revolutionary War. It actually was around for a while, and it was there throughout it all. We always think about the famous cracks in the Liberty Bell,
right.
And the tradition does say that the Liberty Bell received its first little bit of a crack, or small little crack, whenever it first arrived in Philadelphia and they were testing it out. But then it would be quite a while before the Liberty Bell was so cracked that they stopped ringing it on Independence Day or some other big events. It would be quite a bit later when you'd see the crack that we know to be the big crack in the Liberty Bell.
And talking about the Liberty Bell, it gets its name from its inscription, which is Leviticus 25:10, saying, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof.
I love that inscription, that particular passage, and that's on the bell. I also remember reading that the Liberty Bell wasn't actually the first name of the bell itself. It was originally just called the State House Bell or something like that, something really generic. And it did ring at a lot of really key moments, like the death of Benjamin Franklin or George Washington. It rang at the death of Alexander Hamilton. They actually rang the Liberty Bell at that period of time. And it rang at the death of Thomas Jefferson, and obviously John Adams died the same day. I don't know if it was particularly devoted to one or the other person, but Liberty Bell had kind of made a tour around the Revolutionary area throughout the colonies, and had at least gone through a few different cities and had kind of made a few appearances before it got to the end of its functional lifetime, and was able to inspire a lot of people by the things that it symbolized, the liberty that it meant, that like this may have been made in Europe, but it was now like recast in America, the way that the entire American dream is, the way that independence is. We've taken this thing that may have existed somewhere else, but we've perfected it because we're Americans, gosh darn it.
Benjamin Harrison said in 1893, this old bell was made in England, but it had to be recast in America before it was attuned to proclaim the right of self-government and the equal rights of men. And interestingly enough, when Hamilton mentions the Liberty Bell here, a bell rings in the music, and that bell will ring a few more times throughout the song now.
Yeah, I like that use of the literal bells throughout the music to back up the lyrics of that bell that's mentioned here. So Hamilton here is saying, I am more influential than that very influential Liberty Bell. And to be fair, I mean, he really was.
Sure, yeah.
He has a legacy that lasted longer than this inanimate object, but the Liberty Bell was still really important. And here he's putting himself on par with another important thing, saying that when that Liberty Bell was cracked, which wouldn't be during Hamilton's lifetime at all, a little bit of anachronism there in the lyrics here, but when it was cracked, he says, the things that I do are way more important than that. I was louder than it. And he's going to talk about a lot more things that happened and how he is the most important piece of getting all those puzzle pieces into place to make America what it is.
The next thing he mentions specifically is that he wrote Eliza love letters until she fell. Yep. That's what did it, Hamilton.
Which just rings.
You forced her to fall in love with you with your letters.
Yeah, it rings with the worst type of the use of a friend zone of like misogyny, where he's talking about how if I just write enough letters, then she'll love me. She'll owe me love because I'm just going to do enough things to earn her merit and earn her attention. And she's going to just be totally helpless and fall into my lap. And I'm going to earn her attention and her love. And that's not how love works, Hamilton. I know that you have some issues with love in your own life, but that's not how it works. She's not some prize to be won.
To be fair, she did love his letters, but
that's
you're
true.
Right. I mean, she said, now my life gets better every letter that you write me.
Yeah, exactly. So my problem here is not necessarily with the actual representation of the love letters. They're very important in their correspondence. Eliza cherished them. Hamilton did love pouring himself passionately into the words he wrote for Eliza. But the structure of this sentence here, where he's putting it in the middle of this context of him saying, I'm great, I'm great, I'm great, yes. I'm great, and I won Eliza's affection.
Yeah, one of his things that he's proud of is that he made Eliza fall in love with him. Now, that's not a flattering thing. Don't go to your wife and say, aren't you glad I made you fall in love with me? That's not, no, you should go to your wife and say, I'm madly in love with you. Those are different things.
I'm just stirred by the fact that you would honor me with your love. It's a lot more humble. And so up until this point in the song, just to rehash for a second, remember we have gone through the island of St. Croix and the hurricane that destroyed his life, and we've taken him up through the revolutionary era where he wrote his way to revolution and the Liberty Bell, and he's talked about falling in love with Eliza, and now we're up to the point in his life when the Constitution is being ratified by the states, and he says that I wrote about the Constitution and I defended it well. Remember that he wasn't the only guy that wrote about the Constitution.
Right. I mean, he wrote most of the Federalist Papers.
Right, but there were a lot of people talking about it and debating it. And
this was a big debate that was all across this new land.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, he absolutely deserves tons of credit because, remember, he wrote the other 51, and the Federalist Papers cannot be diminished in their historical impact. Whether they influenced the ratification of the actual Constitution at the time is debatable, but courts today quote the Federalist Papers to cite how the founders thought the Constitution should work. That's still an outstanding legacy that really is big. And yeah, let's applaud all of these things that Hamilton's bringing up here because he did write about the Constitution, and dang if he didn't defend it well.
He also is going to establish financial systems. Remember, he was the Treasury Secretary, and he put in these initiatives establishing the national debt, national bank, and the use of paper money rather than coin.
Yeah, and I think that particular legacy of the financial system and the banking system, right down to the customs department that he gets in there, and how he was such a huge part of building the architecture of our government early on, that's one of his biggest legacies, honestly. But he puts that in there saying that I put this forward in the face of ignorance and resistance.
Right, that's the way he views things here. And I actually saw an interesting comment online I liked a lot, where this line is another touch on him becoming his own God, quote unquote. Here he's bringing something into existence. It adds that godlike diction associated with Hamilton in this verse. It's not quite let there be light, but let there be credit.
Oh, I see. And speaking of God, this is that line we referenced earlier where he says, and when my prayers to God were met with indifference, I picked up my pen and I wrote my own deliverance.
Right. And Hamilton's own faith ebbs and flows throughout his life. When he's a young man, he was a pious Christian. There's even stories of his college roommates remembering him praying every morning and every evening.
Yeah, and Eliza actually, in her old age, cherished a hymn that he had written, or at least a religious poem that he had written in his early days, and kept pointing back to that to reference Hamilton's early faith, and kept arguing that really was a part of his whole life.
Right. But as he did mature into an adult, he became more of a deist.
Right.
And he was kind of a scoffer. He, at one point, was asked why God was left out of the Constitution, and he joked, "Oh, we forgot."
Oh, we forgot. Now, when we call him a deist, we have to put that into comparison with people like Thomas Jefferson and all of those areas.
Right. And I also don't think that he ever called himself a deist. He just had deist leanings.
Yeah,
perhaps.
And so when we talk about the faith of the Founding Fathers, it becomes a really complicated issue. Lots of books have been written on this, arguing from multiple sides of every position, saying that we were founded on Christian values, or we were founded on pluralistic values that separated the church and the state, or lots of different ideas saying the founders were deists, the founders were all Christians, the founders were all this or that or whatever. They were humanists, they were secularists. And I do think it's important to note that throughout all of his life, Alexander Hamilton was attacking Thomas Jefferson for being an atheist. He was saying that you don't want to follow Thomas Jefferson because he's influenced by those French atheists over there, the humanists and the Enlightenment. And so Hamilton kind of uses Christianity as an attack to say those other guys are godless, and we want to make sure we hold on to our Christian values and our Christian faith. So when we look into the faith of Hamilton, there's a lot of different ways we can look at this because of that ebb and flow, as you said earlier, that there are
Exactly.
things that he uses for his benefit. There are times when he kind of distances himself from his faith. And I really do hope that later on we can have a full episode where we kind of dive into that. I think that in It's Quiet Uptown, we're going to have a couple of lines where we get to lean into a little bit more of his faith at the end of his life.
Just to briefly touch on that, when his son does die, he's going to lean back into his Christian faith of his youth.
Yes.
And you're going to see that before he dies, he proposes a Christian constitutional society to counter Jacobinism.
Yeah, remember the Jacobins were the ones who were loyal to the French cause and were inspired by the French Revolution and calling each other citizens and talking about how they wanted to inspire American-Franco relations to where they could say, we are all about that French Revolution that's happening overseas. And so the Jacobins were kind of one of the names they used for one another to talk about that French Revolution on that side. And so Hamilton was very much opposed to those societies, and that was one way that he approached it.
Yeah. And that might be viewed as a mere political move.
Yeah,
but
a lot of people painted it as such, for sure.
at the very least, we do know that on his deathbed, he requested and received communion. So that might tell you somewhere of where he stood at the end of his life, and as far as his beliefs went.
Yeah, of course. And man, if you're a person like Hamilton, even your last decisions on your deathbed are going to be questioned and criticized
Right.
back and forth. And so a lot of people point at how the first person he asked to give him communion actually didn't want to follow through with it because he wasn't an attending member at his church very often. And so it would be like, yeah, I recognize that Eliza is very faithful, but who's this Hamilton guy? And so there are people like that look down on his last decisions even, but he was very convinced that he wanted to leave this world having taken communion, having put himself in the right spot. And whether that was just for Eliza's sake so that she would feel more at ease with his passing, or whether that was a legitimate, faithful thing, really isn't for us to decide.
Exactly.
When it comes down to it, if you have an anti-Hamiltonian attitude at the beginning of the day, you're probably going to come out of it with an anti-Hamiltonian approach to his deathbed conversion. And if you're in Hamilton's camp, supporting him, believing all of his comments about God and about faith, then yeah, you're going to say, obviously, this is realistic. It's more like where you come into it determines what you believe about it.
Right.
We're not going to be able to solve that debate because lots of people have been having it forever, and they will continue to have it as long as we want to keep leveling ad hominem arguments against our protagonist here, Hamilton.
So moving on, I was 12 when my mother died. She was holding me. We were sick, and she was holding me. I couldn't seem to die.
So here he kind of takes us all the way back. He's kind of done that climb through his entire timeline, taking us through what he's been through so far, and then he returns back to the eye of the storm, everything is quiet for a moment, and he takes us back to the beginning of his life, where he says, when I was 12, my mother died, and he talks about that super tragic, heartbreaking moment, and it's almost like he bookends this particular stanza with, when the hurricane came, I couldn't seem to die, I didn't drown. And when my mother died, she was holding me, and I couldn't seem to die. He
Right.
repeats that phrase again. It's the bookends of how he interprets his entire life. That's the lens through which he sees his whole history, is that all of these terrible things happened, and I defied death.
And on that line, I couldn't seem to die. Burr can't help himself, but foreshadow here. Wait for it.
Yes. So I love the way he starts singing, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. There are, I think, two ways of reading that in the musical. The one is the obvious one you're talking about, where he says, wait for this thing. Hamilton's about to destroy his life. He's about to put something forward. This is the legend. Wait for it, Derry, because something big is about to happen here, and he's going to destroy his life. Wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. The Reynolds pamphlet's going to come out. But I think it's also telling that this is the advice that Hamilton has often received from Burr. Say, wait for it. Wait for it. This is the way I've lived my life. You should just wait. Wait for the calm to actually end. See what happens. See whether someone actually destroys your reputation and whether you have to respond to it or whether you can actually just let it go. And Hamilton here is hearing that advice, saying, wait for it. Wait for it. Hamilton, just wait for it. Don't destroy yourself. Don't write this paper you're about to write. Just wait, wait, wait. And Hamilton cannot do it because he is not a wait for it kind of guy.
No. So there are those two ways of looking into it. I like both of them because I think it's interesting to see Burr warning him almost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also interesting to see Burr excited for his comeuppance. Wait for it. Wait for it. It's about to happen. Yes.
Yes. I think both of those have to be seen.
Yeah. There's that dichotomy there. And we finally have him saying here, I'll write my way out of this situation too. I'll write my way out. In the staging here, there's this interesting moment where he says this, the ensemble's moving around him still, and Mariah Reynolds comes out of the shadows behind him. He doesn't turn to look at her. He just holds his hand up. And as he says, I'll write my way out, she hands him his pen. And he goes to writing.
Mariah hands him the pen.
And we don't really know fully what this is supposed to mean. But you clearly do see him in the staging getting handed the pen by Mariah. And he doesn't look at her. It could mean something like it's in his head. He thinks she's the reason that this is happening. We wouldn't put that blame on her.
Oh, right. Yeah,
definitely. But there's something going on there in the staging that's real intriguing to see her come out in that red dress again.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's a reference maybe to the fact that some of her writings to him were leaked, and that's part of what went into the Reynolds pamphlets and the writings there, that he kind of uses some of her writing to actually get into the nitty-gritty of what went on between them. It's really hard to dissect that entire moment, but I do think it's a beautiful, poetic moment when we see that Mariah is the one that comes on stage and then hands him the pen. And I like that Mariah then joins the ensemble cast of Eliza, Angelica, and actually George Washington coming out onto the stage to sing the advice that's counter to Burr or complementary to Burr, depending on how you read his lines. And they start singing, "History has its eyes on you." Yeah. On top of what he's about to do, they get that actual advice going over him saying, hey, history's watching you. They're going to remember this moment. And so you need to think twice about what is happening.
Yeah, Washington reminds Hamilton that putting what he did in writing means it goes on record down in history. And the women here in Hamilton's life are warning that his public actions will affect not just his own image and legacy, but also that of the women who loved him.
Yes, so that's the reminder that those ramifications will echo throughout all of his life and his social circles. It's going to be big.
And it's important that that line comes right after what we already brought up, him saying, write everything down far as I can see. And that's that second meaning that I brought up there, where it's no longer far as the eye can see, but the limit of his own sight, his current narrow-mindedness, that it's now only his perspective. He fails to consider the way that others will react to the Reynolds pamphlet and the ramifications it's going to have on people around him. Yeah, so I'm writing down everything as far as I personally can see, and then they remind him, all of history is looking at you with their eyes. All of history is doing this, and that's huge, actually. I love that you're highlighting. So he says he's going to overwhelm them with honesty. And remember, we had talked about how Hamilton wasn't willing to let them drop this case. He wanted them to keep pursuing him and look into all the details. And he was like, I'm upright. Look at everything. I'm honest here. And he thinks that being honest about this is what's going to save him, rather than fessing up and apologizing and going to seek his wife's forgiveness. Instead, he's going to write this book and just share it with the world because his honesty will be his savior. Right. So he values candor as a way to redeem his own reputation because that's what he thinks is going to save him. He's essentially saying, yes, I committed adultery, but that has nothing to do with my relationship with the people, so it shouldn't even be considered. That's not something to do with my politics. Yeah, what you're saying kind of harkens back to the last song we know when Hamilton looked at the trio of Republicans going after him and he said, yes, I have reason for shame, but I have not committed treason and sullied my good name. Exactly. He says, yeah, I have this shame in my background, but you know what? That's not what we should be focused on because I'm a political figure. I expected to get political attacks. And if you read the Reynolds pamphlet, which I hope you'll do, some of you at least, between now and next week. Which it is a little long, 98 pages. That's a lot of overwhelming honesty. It is a lot of overwhelming honesty. You don't have to read it. We'll unpack it for you. We will try to read it before next week because I'm halfway through it. And dang, that guy wrote like he was running out of time. There's a lot of stuff in that. It's dense, it's big, but it kind of starts out with him saying, hey, I expected attacks on my politics. I expected attacks on my upstanding character as far as how I presented myself publicly in my office. But this thing here about my own personal relationships, I never expected people to stoop so low as to attacking my family and my own integrity and my household in a way that's going to hurt my own wife. And so in the Reynolds pamphlet, he kind of looks at everyone else saying, look, you brought me to this point. You are the one who is responsible for attacking and hurting my own wife. And now I'm here having to defend myself and put these words out there. And he doesn't see that his own words may hurt his family. He says that everyone else has brought him to this point.
he is the victim. He is the one who has to write himself out of the problem that he finds himself in. And yeah, it's that moment where he is actually trying to protect his legacy by writing what we know to be the Reynolds pamphlet.
The song comes to a close here. He says, "This is the eye of the hurricane. This is the only way I can protect my legacy." He's made this decision. He's going forward with it. The company comes close to him, and I should mention, because I brought it up earlier, that the hurricane picked up the desk in the chair. They've brought it back down.
Yes.
He's sitting out there. He's writing now. And the company all moves in on him, saying, "Wait for it, wait for it, wait for it."
Mm-hmm.
And then Hamilton announces the Reynolds pamphlet.
Yes. I can't wait till we get to the end of this particular musical when we get to kind of unpack how Hamilton views legacy throughout this entire thing, and how at the end he has this much more mature view of what a legacy truly is. It's planting seeds in a garden that you never get to see. And that's so meaningful. That's so beautiful. An entire musical dedicated to an ambitious protection of legacy. That is so big, so meaningful. I can't wait till the end when we kind of unpack it. I won't go into it all now, but legacy is driving Hamilton, and I will argue later on in this podcast, I think, in the series of this podcast, that his view of legacy kind of grows and matures as the musical goes on. But here he's trying to protect his name, trying to protect his namesake, and he's trying to make sure that no one can destroy his legacy except himself. And we'll see in the next episode whether he is protecting or destroying his legacy by writing this pamphlet.
So until next week, remember that you can get in contact with us at contact@graphocast.com. You can tweet at us at Graphocast. You can leave comments on the webpage, graphocast.com. And if you'd like to contribute, you can check out our Patreon account, patreon.com/Graphocast. If you'd like to talk to us personally on Twitter, I'm at Flesh Eater.
And I'm at Alpha Knight.
And we'll see you next week in our discussion on the Reynolds pamphlet.
Have you read this?
Shh. Hi, Vinton Bayne here again for a real quick announcement. The Graphomania Podcast Network has a new podcast, Read Brave Comics, a comics podcast where your hosts, Corey Casto and I, will introduce you to a wide variety of segments about the world of comic books, some of which will include segments by me and Robbie from this very Hamilton podcast. Check it out now on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, or at graphocast.com, graphocast.com. That's Read Brave Comics.